It was a revolutionary hypothesis that rocked the very foundations of Darwinism and brought two scientists immense fame in the 80s. They tried to offer a solution for the gap in the fossil record, which has challenged evolutionary theory ever since Darwin, but in doing so they caused nothing short of an uproar in the scientific community. This video will talk about this rather significant episode in the history of evolutionary theory and explain why even this most courageous rescue attempt for Darwin's theory, called Punctuated Equilibrium or Punc-Eq, utterly failed. Hi, my name is Lucas and welcome to our series on intelligent design and critical thinking about evolution. Let me start with a recap. In the previous two videos of this series, I showed how paleontology poses a massive challenge to the theory of evolution. Darwin predicted that countless intermediate animal forms must exist in the fossil record, given that animals evolve slowly and gradually from one species into the next. However, what the fossil record actually shows is the exact opposite, namely that whenever new species appear, they do so suddenly, abruptly, and without any evidence of intermediate forms preceding them. The most well-known example is the so-called Cambrian explosion, which happened around 530 million years ago. In the geological record of the time, around 20 different phyla show up within a time span of no more than 10 million years, and without any evidence of intermediate forms preceding them in older strata. The term phyla, singular phylum, you may remember, refers to divisions in the biological classification system. The phyla constitute the highest or widest categories of biological classification in the animal kingdom, with each exhibiting a unique architecture, organizational blueprint, or structural body plans. For example, the phylum of the arthropods includes all insects, spiders, crabs, lobsters, and other animals such as the trilobites. The phylum of the chordates, called phylum Chordata, includes among all animals with a backbone all birds, reptiles, all fish, and mammals. In each phylum, all the animals, as different as they may look from each other, are united by their basic organizational structure and body plan, which is also the very thing that allows us to differentiate between all the phyla. Here is the reason why this is fundamentally important to our discussion. The animal kingdom is usually organized into about 35 different phyla, and the known fossil record features animals representing about 27 of those 35 phyla. Of the 27 phyla featured in the fossil record, approximately 20 make their first and sudden appearance during the Cambrian explosion, in utter defiance of what the theory of evolution tells us to expect. I previously talked about 3 prominent Darwinian attempts to fix this problem, and showed why all of them fail. Check out the 2 first videos in this playlist up here to find out more. In this video, I'm going to tell you about yet another theory or model which came up in the pursuit of reconciling the fossil record with Darwin, one that has reached such fame that it deserves an episode on its own: the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium was advocated by the 2 American paleontologists Stephen J. Gould from Harvard and Niles Eldredge from the American Museum of Natural History. As we're about to see, their theory challenged Darwinian orthodoxy head-on and stirred up the scientific community back in the 70s and early 80s when they went public with their revolutionary hypothesis. Gould became the main spokesperson for punctuated equilibrium and acquired significant popularity as a result of it. Here is what he and Eldredge actually proposed. Punctuated equilibrium rejects the idea that evolutionary change happens slowly and continuously, something that is absolutely fundamental to Darwinian and neo-Darwinian theory. It argues the exact opposite instead, namely that evolution happens rapidly and only in certain limited periods of time. Outside of those periods of rapid change, evolution stands still. Thus, according to the theory, stable periods without change are punctuated by periods of rapid change, hence its name, punctuated equilibrium. Boldly defying the scientific status quo, Gould in a famous article claimed that neo-Darwinism was effectively dead, despite its persistence as textbook orthodoxy, as he marched on to advance what he called a new and general theory of evolution. Making for a rather annoying thorn in the flesh of the scientific establishment, Eldredge and Gould's theory jokingly came to be referred to as evolution by jerks. So what made the 2 paleontologists go down such an unorthodox route? Gould and Eldredge were perfectly aware that neo-Darwinism predicts the existence of an endless array of intermediate fossils. However, being paleontologists by trade, they were also perfectly aware that this endless array of intermediate forms was conspicuous only in its absence. Many breaks in the fossil record are real, was how they put the problem. Eldredge and Gould also observed what they called stasis. With this term, they captured the fact that all species, once they show up in the fossil record, either don't change at all during their geological history or only in ways far too small and insignificant for those changes to explain macroevolution or the origin of new species. Against the backdrop of these observations, Gould, Eldredge and others who jumped onto the iconoclastic bandwagon of punctuated equilibrium claimed that the explanation for the gaps in the fossil record must stem from evolution happening fast rather than slowly. Due to the speed of the evolutionary process, they argued, the intermediate forms existed for too short amounts of time and in too small numbers to leave traces in the fossil record. They backed up this unorthodox idea of fast-paced evolution primarily with a concept they called allopatric speciation. A second, though less important notion in their argument was what they called species selection. Let's look at the two in turn. In order to get the idea of how allopatric speciation works, think of the reindeer population in Greenland. Let's imagine that one specific herd of, let's say, 100 reindeers gets isolated due to an earthquake, leaving a cleft and trapping those 100 reindeers in a valley, cutting them off from the rest of the reindeer population. This secluded group is now reproductively isolated, which offers an opportunity for allopatric speciation. I'll explain in a minute why and how this is the case. But first, we have to understand that the larger a population of any given species, such as the reindeer, the less likely it is for a new genetic trait to get established within that population or to become fixed, as experts say. Imagine a newborn reindeer carrying a new trait that's not been seen before, a mutation that, let's say, allows it to run significantly faster than the average reindeer. You've now got one reindeer with that new trait. However, unless that trait spreads in the population through reproduction so that it becomes a fixed part of the population's genetic stock, this trait's potential to serve as a means of evolutionary change is lost. Thus, the fixation of a genetic trait within a population is a prerequisite for evolutionary change to take place. Again, the larger a population is, the less likely it is for any new genetic trait to become fixed. Conversely, the smaller the population is, the easier it is for a new genetic trait to become fixed, as the trait has to get passed around among fewer individuals. And that's why, in that group of 100 reindeers isolated in a valley, a new trait has a far greater chance of fixation than in the greater reindeer population at large. Based on that, the concept of allopatric speciation essentially holds that new species arise from small subpopulations that have been cut off through earthquakes, landslides, or other events from the big mother population to which they belonged. Given that the fixation of new traits in those small populations is a relatively quick process, evolution can move fast, say Gould and Eldredge, and in big rather than small steps, thus the gap in the fossil record. In addition, the small populations in which allopatric speciation happens offer too few organisms for fossilization, so the argument goes. Let's now turn to species selection, the secondary concept driving punctuated equilibrium. Darwin's theory, as well as neo-Darwinism, hold that fight for survival driving evolutionary change happens as individual organisms compete with each other for resources and the chance to reproduce. Gould and Eldredge were happy to agree that such competition may explain the small or microevolutionary changes within a given species, but they felt that macroevolution is primarily driven not by the competition happening on the level of individual organisms within a species, but by selection at the level of entire species themselves. Thus, species selection says that some species may have properties which cause them to proliferate and speciate into new species or to go extinct. In technical jargon, Gould and Eldredge claimed that the unit of selection in macroevolution is not the individual organism but an entire species. This is why Gould said that I propose as the central proposition of macroevolution that species play the same role that organisms assume in microevolution. Species represent the basic units in theories and mechanisms of macroevolutionary change. It's this idea which Gould denoted as species selection. Alongside the notion of allopatric speciation, it played a minor role, however, in how the theory of punctuated equilibrium attempted to explain the lack of transitional fossils. Give yourself a pat on the shoulder. You've now grasped, at least that's what I'm hoping, the famous or maybe infamous theory of punctuated equilibrium. The question we now turn to is, does this revolutionary hypothesis actually solve the problem of the missing fossils, as it purports to? Well, not really, and here are 3 reasons for that. The first key problem concerns the notion of species selection, which we've just discussed. Remember, species selection explains why some species tend to speciate more than others. Now, for the whole concept of species selection to make sense, you actually have to assume that a pool of different species already exists, upon which the mechanism of species selection can then act. In other words, species selection only makes sense if you already have a pool of various species. But this is exactly the problem. The 20 Cambrian phyla pop up suddenly in the fossil record, and the pool of species from which species selection could have picked those 20 animal forms is exactly what we don't have available in Precambrian strata. Thus, all that species selection does is highlight the massive problem the Cambrian explosion poses for neo-Darwinism, but it doesn't solve it, not even in the slightest. This brings us to the second problem, which concerns allopatric speciation. It is certainly true that new traits have a higher chance of becoming fixed in smaller populations than they do in bigger ones. But there is an important flip side to that. Traits have to appear before they can become fixed, and the initial emergence of new traits is far less likely in smaller populations than in bigger ones. And here is why. The smaller the number of individual organisms, the fewer the opportunities for random mutation to come into action in the reproductive process, and thus the smaller the number of new traits you can get. Yet new traits are a necessary prerequisite for evolutionary change. Again, fixing a new trait is easier in smaller populations as fewer organisms need to catch the trait. However, getting such a new trait to emerge in the first place is far harder in smaller populations than it is in bigger populations, because of the amount of random mutations that can possibly occur. Darwin himself pointed out that this numbers game is key when he said that forms existing in larger numbers will always have a better chance of presenting further favorable variations for natural selection to seize on than will the rarer forms which exist in lesser numbers. Gould recognized this dilemma, which is why he later adjusted his hypothesis by saying that while new traits may get fixed in short periods of time in smaller populations, the emergence of such traits happens among larger populations over the long periods of stasis. But with this adjustment, punctuated equilibrium immediately ceases to be an explanation for the gap in the fossil record. Remember, the key point of the theory was this: evolution happens not gradually and slowly, but abruptly and rapidly, and among smaller populations. And this explains why there are no intermediate forms in the fossil record. This seems to require too much evolutionary change too quickly. But think about it. If new traits are actually generated in large populations and not rapidly but during the long periods of stasis, as the adjusted theory of punctuated equilibrium admits, then we have every reason to expect the existence of intermediate forms in the fossil record. I mean, this is the very issue that gave rise to Gould and Eldredge's original theory of punctuated equilibrium. Acknowledging that the fossils aren't there, they proposed punctuations of rapid evolutionary change happening among smaller populations. as the explanation for those real breaks in the fossil record. But given that the short time periods and smaller populations they initially argued for have now been reversed back again into longer time periods and bigger populations, we find ourselves at square zero again in the search for an explanation for the lacking fossils. This gets us to the third problem plaguing punctuated equilibrium. Both mechanisms, allopatric speciation and species selection, are limited in that they can only explain the selection upon traits and species that already exist, but they cannot explain the origin of complex traits of the higher taxonomic groups. This is a key issue, and in order to understand it fully, let's look at two examples of how taxonomy works. The species of the bald eagle belongs to the genus Halieides, also known as the sea eagles, the order of accipitriforms or hawk-like birds, and the class of birds, and the phylum of the chordates. The golden-ringed dragonfly, on the other hand, belongs to the genus of Corduligaster, a specific genus of dragonflies, the order of Odonata, which is one specific order of flying insects, and to the class of insects, and ultimately to the phylum of the arthropods. One of the points of such taxonomic structuring is that it tells us, for example, that the species in the phylum of the chordates that belong to the class aves or birds, rather than, let's say, to the class of mammals, have feathers, toothless beaks, and a lightweight skeleton. Within this class, all species belonging to the order of accipitriforms are hawk-like birds of prey that hunt during the day. In the same vein, the species in the phylum of the arthropods that belong to the class of insects have 3 paired legs, compound eyes, and 1 pair of antennae. Within this class, those which specifically belong to the family of Corduligastridae, for example, have large brown or black bodies with yellow markings and even more specific characteristics that could be named when looking at the specific genus of Corduligaster. I guess you get the gist of it. Generally speaking, the lower you go on the taxonomic hierarchy, the less complex the traits are by which you distinguish between the different categories. Vice versa, the higher up you move on the taxonomic ladder, generally the more complex the traits are by which groups are distinguished from one another. For example, the traits that distinguish the class of aves or birds from the class of mammals within the phylum of the chordates are far more complex than the traits that distinguish the bald eagle from the African fish eagle, both of which belong to the genus of sea eagles. Let's take the genus of sea eagles to discuss the third problem plaguing punctuated equilibrium. This genus has 10 different living species. Allopatric speciation would tell us how a new 11th species is formed if, let's say, a group of bald eagles were to get isolated somehow. Species selection, on the other hand, might tell us why a certain sea eagle species may go extinct or speciate into a novel sea eagle species. However, allopatric speciation and species selection cannot explain the emergence of the higher level complexities that mark entire classes, orders, and families. They cannot explain why within the class of birds there are, besides sea eagles, also hummingbirds or birds of paradise, which feature traits that make them look significantly different from sea eagles. In other words, allopatric speciation and species selection cannot account for the emergence of the more complex traits that allow us to define and differentiate between the higher taxonomic categories. This is why Richard Dawkins said that what I mainly want a theory of evolution to do is explain complex, well-designed mechanisms like hearts, hands, eyes, and echolocation. Nobody, not even the most ardent species selectionist, thinks that species selection can do this. Now, you might be surprised to hear, or maybe not, that at some point even Gould himself admitted this problem. What was his way out? He returned back, yet again, to good old neo-Darwinian orthodoxy. In the Structure of Evolutionary Theory, which was published in the year of his death, he conceded, "I recognize that we know no mechanism for the origin of such organismal features other than conventional natural selection at the organismic level." You remember, this retort to neo-Darwinian orthodoxy is what we already encountered when Gould needed a way out of the dilemma posed by his concept of allopatric speciation. And so, while Gould and Eldredge initially started out to challenge neo-Darwinism head-on with their rejection of a slow, gradual mode of evolution, Gould eventually turned around later, trying to sync his theorizing again with the classical standards of neo-Darwinism, as he recognized that punctuated equilibrium simply doesn't hold up. That's why historian of science David Sepkoski notes that, despite the brashness of many of his claims on behalf of punctuated equilibrium over the years, one is brought time and again back to the reconciliatory, even conservative justifications Gould made for his theory. Thus, given that the leading proponent of punctuated equilibrium ended up with at least one of his feet, if not both of them, back in the door of neo-Darwinism, it is no wonder that only few, if any, evolutionary biologists see punctuated equilibrium as a highly important model today. This now means that the conundrum of the fossil record, which plagues neo-Darwinism, has still not been solved. Remember, the very thing that drove Gould and Eldredge's project of punctuated equilibrium was their honest recognition that the countless intermediate forms which are to be expected in evolutionary theory are simply not there. But if punctuated equilibrium cannot solve the problem, well, then we're back to square one with the question, why do 20 phyla show up so suddenly in the Cambrian explosion, if species supposedly evolve over millions of years? Well, that's the $1 million question Darwinists still haven't answered. If you followed this series, you will know that in the last episode we looked at 3 hypotheses which tried to fix that problem, but failed. Punctuated equilibrium is yet another fruitless attempt. What unites all 4 theories, besides their failure, is that they are at home in the discipline of paleontology. Punctuated equilibrium was the last major attempt of Darwinists to paleontologically vindicate evolutionary theory, so to speak. And one could say that its failure has sealed the very irreconcilability of the fossil record with neo-Darwinism for good. This is why Darwinists began to turn to genetics and molecular biology in the attempt to bolster evolutionary theory independently of the fossil record, which has only caused them headaches. If you like this video, check out my channel Deflate to hear more from me, or go to intelligentdesign.org to learn more about the issues we talked about in this episode.